I built houses for 30 years. Strong hands, strong back, strong will. Every morning at 5:30, I'd lace up my work boots and head out to turn blueprints into something real, something that would stand long after I was gone. Foundations that wouldn't crack, walls that wouldn't bow, roofs that would keep families dry through the worst storms. But apparently, none of that matters when you're 72 and your son thinks you've become too expensive to keep around. My name is Frank Sullivan, and if you think this is going to be one of those sad stories about a forgotten old man withering away in some nursing home, well, you'd be half right. I am in a nursing home. Room 237 at Sunset Manor, to be exact. The kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz like angry wasps and the smell of industrial disinfectant can't quite cover up what it's trying to hide. But forgotten? No, that's where you'd be wrong. See, most people look at a 72-year-old man and see limitations. They see someone whose best days are behind him, someone who needs taking care of instead of someone who spent 3 decades taking care of others. They see a burden on the monthly budget rather than the person who made that budget possible in the first place. Marcus, my son, definitely sees me that way now. Marcus Sullivan, 45 years old, successful businessman. Father of two, homeowner in one of those suburban neighborhoods where the grass stays green year-round because the HOA fees are higher than most people's rent. Marcus, who never had to wonder where his college tuition would come from, never had to stress about his wedding costs, never had to lose sleep over whether he could afford the down payment on his first house. Marcus, who 3 weeks ago signed the paperwork to put me in the cheapest nursing home he could find without even asking if I had a preference about where I'd spend what he keeps calling my remaining time. I should have seen the warning signs. They started about 6 months ago, right after I had my stroke. Nothing major, what the doctors called a minor cerebrovascular event. Fancy words for when your brain decides to take a little vacation and leaves you with a slight limp and a hand that doesn't always do what you tell it to do. Most days I'm fine. Some days I need my cane. But apparently, any sign of weakness was all Marcus needed to start calculating. That's when the dinner conversations began changing. Instead of asking how I was feeling, Marcus would ask how much my medications cost. Instead of talking about his kids' soccer games, he'd mention how expensive home care services were becoming. Instead of discussing the weather, he'd casually bring up articles he'd read about planning for long-term care expenses. I'd built that boy's entire foundation, literally and figuratively. When he graduated from state with his business degree, I was the one who paid the $28,000 in remaining student loans. When he married Sarah, I covered the reception costs because they'd already stretched their budget on the venue. When they bought their first house, I provided the down payment. When his consulting business struggled those first 2 years, I floated him enough money to keep the lights on and the employees paid. 30 years of giving. 30 years of making sure my son would never have to struggle the way I did when I was starting out. 30 years of putting his future ahead of my comfort, his dreams ahead of my retirement savings. And now he's worried about whether my care is cutting into his children's college fund. Don't get me wrong, I understand that taking care of an aging parent isn't easy. I watched my own father decline, saw how it affected my mother, felt the weight of those decisions myself. But there's a difference between struggling to provide good care and simply looking for the cheapest option available. Marcus chose cheap over care. Convenience over compassion, his financial comfort over my basic dignity. 3 weeks ago, he walked into this place, spent exactly 12 minutes reviewing the facility, checked his phone twice during the intake meeting, and signed papers that would park me in room 237 for the bargain price of $3,200 a month. Most of that conversation, he spent looking at his watch or responding to text messages. When the administrator, a nice woman named Sarah Chen, asked if he had any questions about visiting hours or meal preferences, Marcus just shrugged and said, "He's pretty flexible. Whatever works for you folks. Whatever works for you folks." Like I was a piece of furniture being delivered. But here's what Marcus doesn't know. What he never bothered to learn during all those years when I was busy making his life easier. I didn't survive 30 years in construction by being weak or helpless or naive. You don't build a successful business in that industry without learning how to read people, how to plan ahead, and how to solve problems that other people think are impossible. Marcus thinks he's managed his old man problem efficiently and economically. He thinks I'm just another expense item on his monthly budget, something to be optimized and minimized. He has no idea what he's actually done, no idea that his decision to put me in the cheapest care available wasn't the end of his burden, it was the beginning of his education. Because I didn't just spend 30 years building houses, you see. I spent 30 years building something else too, something that Marcus is about to discover the hard way. But that story? Well, that starts with room 237 and the smell of industrial disinfectant. Room 237 smells like industrial disinfectant and defeat. That's the first thing that hits you when you walk through the door. Not the faded beige walls or the fluorescent light that flickers every few seconds. It's the smell, sharp, chemical, the kind of clean that's trying way too hard to cover up something you don't want to think about. The room itself is about what you'd expect for $3,200 a month. One hospital bed with rails that have seen better decades. One nightstand with a drawer that doesn't quite close. One chair that's probably older than my grandson. And one window looking out onto the parking lot, where I can watch visitors come and go, though not many seem to be coming back. Let me tell you about that first day, about how Marcus handled what he probably thought was just another item on his to-do list. We arrived at Sunset Manor at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because Marcus checked his phone 3 times during the walk from the car. The intake meeting was scheduled for 10:30, which gave us 15 minutes in what they called the family waiting area. 4 chairs around a coffee table covered with magazines from the Clinton administration. Marcus spent those 15 minutes making business calls, not to his wife, not to his kids. Business. Something about a contract deadline and a client who was being unreasonable about the timeline. He paced back and forth, talking into his wireless earpiece, completely oblivious to the fact that his father was sitting 3 feet away, about to be permanently installed in a place that smelled like sanitized sadness. When Sarah Chen, the facility administrator, came out to get us, Marcus didn't even finish his call. He just held up one finger and kept talking about quarterly projections and market penetration strategies. Sarah seemed nice enough. Mid-30s, tired eyes, the kind of tired that comes from caring about people in a system that doesn't give you enough resources to actually help them. She waited patiently while Marcus wrapped up his call, then led us down a hallway lined with residents in wheelchairs who looked like they were waiting for something that was never going to come. The intake meeting took place in Sarah's cramped office. The walls were covered with state certificates, inspection reports, and emergency contact forms. Sarah had clearly done this before. She had a whole routine worked out for transitioning families through what she called a difficult time. She started with the standard paperwork: medical history, insurance, emergency contacts. Then she got to the personal questions, the ones supposed to help them provide individualized care. "Does your father have any hobbies or interests we should know about?" Sarah asked, looking between Marcus and me. Marcus glanced up from his phone. He'd been texting throughout the meeting and shrugged. He used to do construction work, built houses and stuff. I don't think he's really up for much of that anymore. Used to do construction work. Like 30 years of building half the commercial district downtown was just some weekend hobby. What about social activities? Sarah continued. Does he enjoy games, reading, music? We have a pretty active social calendar here. Another glance at the phone. Another shrug. He's pretty flexible. Whatever you folks have set up is probably fine. Sarah tried again. How about visitors? Family members, friends? It really helps when residents maintain their social connections. This time Marcus didn't even look up. I'll try to stop by when I can. Work's pretty demanding right now, and with the kids' schedules, you know how it is. I knew exactly how it was. Sarah finished the paperwork in 20 minutes, then offered a facility tour. Marcus checked his watch and declined. I'm sure it's fine. Dad's not really picky. Are we good here? I've got a lunch meeting. We were good. 12 minutes of actual FaceTime, if you didn't count the phone calls and texts. 12 minutes to process 30 years of relationship into a monthly billing statement. Marcus shook Sarah's hand, gave me a quick pat on the shoulder that was supposed to pass for a hug, and promised to check in soon. Then he was gone, leaving me with a woman who looked almost as uncomfortable as I felt. Would you like to see your room now, Mr. Sullivan? Sarah asked. For the first time since we'd arrived, someone was actually talking to me instead of about me. The walk to room 237 gave me my first real look at Sunset Manor's operations. We passed the main common area, where 15 residents sat in front of a television playing some daytime talk show at a volume that could be heard in the next county. Most were asleep. A few stared at the screen with blank expressions that made you wonder if anyone was home. The hallways were narrow, lined with carpet that had probably been beige once but was now some indefinable color between brown and gray. The walls were covered with artwork that looked ordered from a catalog specializing in cheerful but inoffensive images for healthcare facilities. Sarah kept up commentary as we walked. Mealtimes, activity schedules, visitor policies. She was trying to be helpful, but you could tell she'd given this tour 100 times before. You could also tell that most families had asked more questions than Marcus bothered to ask. When we reached room 237, Sarah helped me get settled. She showed me the call button, explained the meal schedule, introduced me to nearby staff members. She was professional, efficient, and genuinely trying to be kind. But kindness only goes so far in a system running on half the staff it needs. After Sarah left, I sat on the edge of that hospital bed and looked around my new home. One small closet for the few clothes Marcus had packed. One dresser with 3 drawers, 2 of which actually opened. One bathroom I'd share with whoever ended up behind that thin curtain divider. But when I was unpacking, I found the first sign that this situation might not play out exactly the way Marcus thought it would. My leather wallet, the one I'd carried for 25 years, was tucked in the bottom of the duffel bag Marcus had packed. He'd probably thrown it in without thinking. Just one more item to transfer. But Marcus had never looked carefully at that wallet. He'd never noticed the hidden compartment behind the credit card slots, where I kept certain things that weren't his business. Emergency credit cards he didn't know about. Account numbers for investments he'd never heard of. Contact information for people who owed me favors from 30 years of doing business the right way. Marcus thought he'd solved his problem by parking me in the cheapest nursing home he could find. He thought I was just going to sit quietly and wait for my remaining time to run out without causing inconvenience or expense. But as I sat there that first night, listening to Sunset Manor settling around me, the murmur of televisions, the squeak of wheelchairs, the distant conversation of night shift staff, I realized something Marcus hadn't considered. He'd given me exactly what I needed: time, privacy, and a very clear understanding of who my son really was when he thought nobody was watching. Room 237 might smell like disinfectant and defeat, but it was about to become my planning headquarters, and Marcus had no idea what kind of education he was about to receive. Marcus showed up exactly 1 week later, and I could tell from the way he walked into my room that this wasn't a social visit. It was a Tuesday afternoon around 2:30, and he was wearing that particular expression he gets when he's about to deliver news he thinks I won't like, but that he's already decided is for my own good. He didn't sit down, just stood there at the foot of my bed, checking his phone one more time before sliding it into his jacket pocket like he was making some kind of grand gesture about giving me his undivided attention. "Hey, Dad," he said, not quite making eye contact. "How are you settling in? Everything going okay with the staff and all that?" It was the kind of question that sounded caring if you didn't know Marcus very well. But I'd been listening to him talk for 45 years, and I could hear what was really behind it. He wasn't asking how I was doing. He was checking to make sure I wasn't causing any problems that might require his attention. "I'm managing just fine," I told him. "Sarah and the staff here are doing their best with what they've got to work with." Marcus nodded like he was actually listening, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly when I mentioned that the staff was doing their best with what they've got. He'd caught the implication, and he didn't like it. "Well, that's good," he said, "because I wanted to talk to you about something, and I need you to understand that this is coming from a place of trying to be responsible about our finances." Our finances. Like he'd been contributing to the household budget for the past 30 years instead of the other way around. "Dad, I've been looking at the numbers, and this place is really expensive. $3,200 a month. That's almost $40,000 a year. And with the kids getting older, college costs coming up, Sarah's car needing to be replaced, we're looking at some serious financial pressure over the next few years." I sat there and let him talk, watching his face, listening to the tone of his voice. This was a speech he'd practiced. He'd thought about this conversation, planned it out, maybe even rehearsed it with his wife. "I've been doing some research," Marcus continued, "and there are other facilities in the area that offer the same basic services for significantly less money. There's a place called Hillview Extended Care, about 20 minutes from here, and they charge $1,800 a month. That's $1,400 less than what we're paying here. Same basic services." I wondered if Marcus had actually visited Hillview Extended Care, or if he'd just looked at their website and compared pricing sheets. "The thing is," Marcus went on, "I need you to understand that this isn't just about my family's financial situation. This is about being realistic about your remaining time here. The doctors haven't given us any kind of timeline, obviously, but we need to plan for the possibility that this could be a long-term arrangement. Remaining time." He actually said remaining time, like he was talking about a magazine subscription that was about to expire. I took a long look at my son, standing there in his $500 suit, explaining why saving $1,400 a month on my care was more important than the quality of that care. This was the same boy I'd sent to college without him worrying about student loans. The same young man whose wedding reception I'd paid for. The same father whose house down payment had come out of my retirement savings. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level, "do you remember when you graduated from state?" He looked confused. "Yeah, of course. Why? You had some student loans left over, about $28,000 if I remember correctly. You were worried about the monthly payments, how they were going to affect your ability to save for a house." "Dad, I don't see what that has to do with—" "I paid those loans off," I continued. $28,000. Wrote the check the week after your graduation. You remember that? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I remember, and I've always been grateful for that. How about your wedding? You and Sarah had that beautiful reception at the country club. 200 guests, open bar. That band you wanted. Dad, where are you going with this? $12,000. That's what I contributed to your wedding costs. Because you told me you'd already stretched your budget on the venue. I could see Marcus getting agitated. He knew where this was heading. And then there was the house, I said. Your first house. You needed a down payment. But your savings weren't quite there yet, because you'd been putting money toward the wedding for 2 years. Dad, please. $45,000. That's what I gave you for the down payment. Not a loan, Marcus. A gift. Because I wanted my son to be able to start his adult life without having to struggle the way I did. Marcus was staring at the floor now, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. And then, when your consulting business was struggling those first couple of years, when you weren't sure if you were going to be able to make payroll and keep your employees, you came to me again. Dad, stop. How much was that, Marcus? How much did I loan you to keep your business afloat? And I'm calling it a loan, even though we both know you never paid it back. Marcus looked up at me, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, I could see something that might have been shame in his eyes. $60,000, I answered my own question. $60,000 to keep Sullivan Consulting from going under. I let that sit for a moment, watching my son process the numbers he'd apparently forgotten about. So let's add that up, shall we? 28,000 for your student loans, 12,000 for your wedding, 45,000 for your house down payment, 60,000 for your business. That's $145,000, Marcus. Marcus didn't answer. But we're not done yet, are we? Because there were also the smaller things over the years. Car repairs when money was tight. Christmas gifts for the grandkids that were more generous than your budget allowed. That vacation to Disney World when the kids were little. The new roof for your house 3 years ago when the insurance didn't cover as much as you'd expected. I paused, doing the mental math I'd been carrying around for years. All told, over the past 30 years, I've given you somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. And that's not counting the interest that money could have earned if I'd kept it in investments instead of using it to make sure my son never had to worry about money. Marcus was looking at me now with an expression I'd never seen before. It might have been the first time in his adult life that he'd actually thought about how much his financial security had cost his father. And now, I said, my voice still calm, still level, you're standing here telling me that paying for decent care in my old age is putting too much strain on your budget. You're asking me to move to a cheaper facility so you can save $1,400 a month. The room was very quiet. Down the hall, I could hear someone's television, a game show where the audience was applauding someone's good fortune. $1,400 a month, Marcus. That's what you want to save on your old man's care. Do you have any idea how long it would take for that savings to add up to even half of what I spent putting you through college? Marcus opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again. 2.5 years, I answered for him. It would take you 2.5 years of saving that $1,400 a month to equal what I spent on your college loans alone. I let that sink in before I continued. So here's what I need you to understand, son. This conversation we're having right now, it's not really about money. It's about what kind of man you've become and what kind of father you think I was. Because if you can stand there and tell me with a straight face that my care is too expensive, after everything I've done to make sure you never had to worry about money, then we've got a much bigger problem than monthly nursing home fees. Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Now, I said, settling back against my pillows, did you want to continue this conversation about moving me to a cheaper facility? Or did you maybe want to take some time to think about whether that's really the path you want to go down? For a long moment, Marcus just stood there. Then, without saying another word, he turned around and walked out of room 237. That was when I knew exactly what kind of education my son was going to need. And sitting there in that room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat, I started planning exactly how I was going to give it to him. 3 days passed before I saw Marcus again. And when he finally showed up, he looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. But that conversation had done something more than just keep him awake at night. It had given me exactly what I needed, absolute clarity about what kind of person my son had become, and more importantly, what I was going to do about it. See, most people in my situation would have spent those 3 days feeling sorry for themselves, maybe complaining to the nurses or calling other family members to tell them how badly they were being treated. But I didn't get where I am in life by sitting around waiting for other people to solve my problems. I spent those 3 days learning everything I could about Sunset Manor. The facility has a small computer lab that most of the residents ignore. It's tucked away near the back of the building, past the physical therapy room, and just before you get to the administrative offices. 3 desktop computers, probably 5 years old, with internet access that's slower than dial-up used to be. But it's functional, and more importantly, it's usually empty. Eleanor Martinez, the activities director, is the one who gave me access. Eleanor's been working here for 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between residents who are genuinely declining and residents who just need something meaningful to do with their time. "You're not like most of our folks, are you, Mr. Sullivan?" She asked me on my 4th day here when she found me reading the newspaper in the common room instead of staring at the television like everyone else. "How do you mean?" I asked her. "Most people who end up here, they're ready to let other people make all the decisions for them. You don't seem like the type who's ready for that." Eleanor is a smart woman. Mid-60s, I'd guess, with the kind of sharp eyes that come from spending a lifetime paying attention to people. She'd been a head nurse at the county hospital before she took this job, and you could tell she wasn't used to working in a place where the primary goal was keeping costs low instead of keeping people healthy. "I'm not ready for anything," I told her, "but I am interested in understanding my options." That's when she showed me the computer lab. "Most of the residents don't know how to use them," Eleanor explained, unlocking the door with a key she kept on a lanyard around her neck. "And the few who do usually just want to look at photos their grandchildren posted on Facebook. But if you're looking to do some research, they're all yours." Research. That's exactly what I was looking to do. The first thing I looked up was Hillview Extended Care, the place Marcus wanted to move me to. Their website was professionally designed, full of smiling elderly people and cheerful-looking staff members, but it didn't take much digging to find the state inspection reports. 3 citations in the past year for inadequate staffing, 2 more for improper medication management, and a complaint filed by a family member alleging that their father had been left sitting in soiled clothing for hours because there weren't enough aides on duty to handle basic care. Hillview Extended Care, $1,800 a month, and apparently you get exactly what you pay for. But then I started looking into Sunset Manor itself, and that's when things got interesting. The facility is privately owned, has been for 8 years. The current owner, according to the county records, is something called Meridian Healthcare Solutions, which turns out to be a subsidiary of a larger company based in Atlanta. They own 17 nursing homes across 3 states, and from what I could find online, their business model seems to be buying struggling facilities, cutting costs to the bone, and squeezing out whatever profit they can before selling them off to the next company willing to take a chance on the healthcare industry. Sunset Manor itself has been for sale for the past 6 months. The asking price is $2.4 million, which includes the building, the land, and all the existing contracts with staff and residents. According to the listing, the facility is profitable but requires significant capital investment to meet evolving industry standards. In other words, it's making money, but barely, and it would cost more money to bring it up to the level where people would actually want to live here. But here's the thing that caught my attention. The listing mentioned that the current owners would consider offers significantly below asking price for qualified buyers with demonstrated experience in healthcare facility management. I spent the rest of that afternoon researching commercial real estate financing, nursing home regulations, and the process for transferring ownership of healthcare facilities. By the time the computer lab closed at 4 o'clock, I had a pretty good understanding of what it would take to buy Sunset Manor. The next day, I called Janet Morrison. Janet's been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since my regular attorney retired and recommended her firm. She handled the legal work when I sold my construction business, and she's been managing some of my investments ever since. More importantly, she's the kind of lawyer who doesn't ask too many questions when a client calls with an unusual request. "Frank," she said when I got her on the phone, "how are you settling in at the new place?" "I'm settling in just fine, Janet, but I need to ask you about something, and I need you to keep this conversation confidential for now." "Of course, what can I help you with?" "I want to know about setting up a shell corporation for the purpose of purchasing real estate. Specifically, I want to know about purchasing a nursing home." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Frank," Janet said finally, "are you thinking about buying the facility you're living in?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," I told her, "but right now I just need to know if it's legally possible, and if so, what it would involve." Janet's a good lawyer, which means she's used to clients who don't always explain their motivations right away. "It's definitely possible," she said. "There are regulatory hurdles you'd have to clear, licensing requirements, inspections, that sort of thing. But yes, it can be done. How serious are you about this?" "Serious enough to want you to start the paperwork for a shell corporation tomorrow morning." "Frank, can I ask why you want to buy a nursing home?" I looked around the computer lab with its flickering fluorescent lights and its outdated equipment, and I thought about Marcus standing at the foot of my bed 3 days earlier, explaining to me why my care was too expensive for his budget. Let's just say I'm interested in improving the quality of life for some people I care about. That was true enough, and by the time I was finished, Marcus was going to care about the quality of life in nursing homes a lot more than he did right now. Tank Rodriguez found me in the common room exactly 2 weeks after my conversation with Janet Morrison. I was sitting in one of those plastic chairs that seem to be standard issue for nursing homes everywhere, reading the business section of the newspaper and trying to ignore the television that was blasting some morning talk show at a volume that could wake the dead. Tank's a big man built like the plumber he'd been for 40 years, with hands that look like they could still install pipe fittings blindfolded. He was visiting his wife Rosa, who'd been here about 6 months with dementia, and I could see the worry in his eyes every time he looked at her. But when he looked at me, I saw something else entirely. Recognition. "You're Frank Sullivan, aren't you?" he asked, stopping next to my chair. "You built the Morrison Industrial Complex downtown, back in the 90s. I folded my newspaper and looked up at him. "I did. You worked on that project." "Tommy Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand. "I did all the plumbing, best commercial job I ever worked on, if I'm being honest. You ran a tight operation, but you treated your subcontractors fair. Not everyone in construction can say that." Tank, I remembered him now. One of the most reliable plumbers I'd ever worked with, never missed a deadline, never cut corners on materials, and never gave me any grief about change orders when the architects decided they wanted to move things around halfway through the project. "Tank Rodriguez," I said, shaking his hand. "You did good work on that job. What brings you to Sunset Manor?" His expression darkened. "My wife Rosa, early onset dementia. She's only 68, but she doesn't recognize me most days anymore." I nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that. That's a hard road to walk." "What about you?" Tank asked. "You don't seem like the type who'd end up in a place like this unless something went seriously wrong." That's when I decided to take a chance. See, Tank and I had worked together for 3 months on the Morrison project, and in construction, 3 months is long enough to get a real sense of someone's character. Tank was the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late when the job required it, and never said anything bad about anyone unless they truly deserved it. More importantly, he was the kind of man who believed in loyalty and doing right by people who'd done right by you. "My son decided that keeping me at home was too expensive," I told him. "So he found the cheapest place he could and dropped me off here like a piece of furniture he didn't need anymore." Tank's face went hard. "That's cold, boss, real cold." "Boss, he'd called me boss on the Morrison job too, even though he was working for his own company. It was a sign of respect, not hierarchy, and hearing it again reminded me why I'd always made sure Tank got paid on time and never had to chase down invoices. "It is what it is," I said, "but I'm not planning to just sit here and let it stay that way." Tank raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I looked around the common room, making sure nobody was close enough to overhear our conversation. Most of the other residents were either asleep in their chairs or completely absorbed by whatever was happening on the television. "Tank, what would you say if I told you I was thinking about buying this place?" He stared at me for a long moment, then started to grin. "I'd say that sounds like Frank Sullivan, all right, always thinking 3 steps ahead of everybody else." "The thing is," I continued, "this facility has good bones, but it's been neglected. The ownership company is more interested in cutting costs than maintaining quality. If someone were to buy it and invest in proper improvements, it could be a really nice place for people to live." Tank was nodding slowly. "What kind of improvements are we talking about?" "Better lighting, for starters. These fluorescent fixtures make everyone look like they're dying, whether they are or not. New flooring in the common areas. Updated plumbing in some of the bathrooms. Maybe some landscaping outside so people have something decent to look at through their windows." "That's good work," Tank said. "The kind of work that makes a difference in people's lives." "It is, and it's the kind of work that would require some skilled tradesmen who know what they're doing and can be trusted to do it right." Tank's grin got wider. "Are you offering me a job, boss? I'm asking if you'd be interested in helping improve this place, assuming I can make the purchase happen. Not just you, but maybe some of the other guys you've worked with over the years. Good people who understand that when you're building something for elderly folks, every detail matters." Tank looked around the common room, taking in the worn carpeting, the scuffed walls, the furniture that had probably been there since the place opened. Then he looked back at me. "You know, Frank, I've been retired for 3 years now, and I've been going out of my mind with boredom. Rosa doesn't know who I am half the time. My kids are all grown up and busy with their own lives, and I've watched every fishing show on television at least twice." He paused, studying my face. "But more than that, this place, it's not good enough for people like Rosa. It's not good enough for people like you. And if there's a chance to make it better, to make it the kind of place where people can live with dignity instead of just waiting to die, then yeah, I'm interested." "It wouldn't be volunteer work," I told him. "I'd pay standard rates for quality work." "Even better," Tank said. "When do we start?" "Let me make a phone call first." Tank pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and handed it to me. "Use mine." The landlines here probably aren't private enough for the kind of conversation you need to have. I dialed a number I'd memorized 20 years ago, the direct line to Miguel Santos, who'd been my electrical contractor on a dozen different projects. Miguel answered on the second ring. Santos Electric. This is Miguel. Miguel, it's Frank Sullivan. I've got a proposition for you. Frank, how the hell are you, my friend? I heard you retired. I did retire, but I've got a project that might interest you. Commercial renovation work, nursing home facility. Probably 6 weeks of steady work for a good crew. I'm listening. The thing is, Miguel, this needs to be done right. We're talking about improving the quality of life for people who can't advocate for themselves. Are you interested in that kind of work? Miguel didn't hesitate. When do you need me to look at the specs? I looked at Tank, who was nodding his approval. Let me get back to you on that, but start thinking about putting together a crew of your best people. After I hung up, Tank was still grinning. Just like old times, boss, you always did know how to put together the right team for the job. This isn't just any job, Tank. This is personal. The best jobs always are, Tank said. So what's the next step? I folded my newspaper and stood up from that uncomfortable plastic chair. The next step is making sure my son understands exactly what kind of education he's about to receive. The morning I signed the purchase agreement for Sunset Manor, Marcus was 20 miles away at his country club, sitting on the terrace with his breakfast and his Wall Street Journal, probably complaining to his golf buddies about how expensive it was getting to take care of his aging father. I know this because Tank had driven past the country club on his way to meet me at Janet Morrison's law office, and he'd seen Marcus's BMW in the parking lot. Tank made a point of mentioning it when he walked into the conference room where Janet and I were going over the final paperwork. Your son's having a leisurely Tuesday morning, Tank said, settling into one of the leather chairs around Janet's conference table. Saw his car at Pine Valley. Must be nice to have that kind of free time when other people are handling your responsibilities for you. Janet looked up from the stack of documents she'd been organizing. Mr. Rodriguez, I have to ask again. Are you sure you want to be here for this? The legal requirements don't require any witnesses beyond myself and my paralegal. Tank glanced at me and I nodded. We'd discussed this the night before. Tank had earned the right to be in that room, not just because he was going to be managing the renovation work, but because he understood what this purchase really meant. Tank's been part of this from the beginning, I told Janet. He stays. Janet had been my lawyer long enough to know when not to argue with me. She pushed the signature page across the table. Frank, I want to make sure you understand what you're doing here. This isn't just buying a piece of real estate. You're taking on the responsibility for 43 residents, 38 employees, and all the regulatory oversight that comes with operating a healthcare facility. I picked up the pen she'd placed next to the documents. Janet, I've been thinking about responsibility a lot lately, about what it means when someone's taken care of you for 30 years and what you owe them in return. This is about more than your son, isn't it? It's about a lot of things, I said, signing my name on the first page. It's about the fact that Rosa Rodriguez deserves better care than she's getting. It's about making sure that Eleanor Martinez has the resources she needs to actually help people, instead of just managing their decline. I moved to the second page. It's about proving that 72 years old doesn't mean powerless, and it's about teaching my son that actions have consequences, even when you think nobody's watching. Tank was grinning as I signed the third page. But mostly, I continued, it's about the fact that I've got the money, I've got the expertise, and I've got the time to do something meaningful with what's left of my life. Janet made notes on her copy of the documents as I finished the signature pages. The Shell Corporation is set up exactly as you requested, she said. Sullivan Holdings LLC is the official purchaser, with you as the sole managing member. The existing management company will continue operations for 30 days while the state processes the ownership transfer and licensing paperwork. And during those 30 days, you're officially a resident of Sunset Manor, who happens to own the building you're living in. The staff won't be informed of the ownership change until the state approvals are final. I handed the signed documents back to Janet. Perfect. That gives Tank and his crew time to start the improvement work without anyone asking too many questions about who's paying for it. Tank leaned forward in his chair. Speaking of which, Miguel's crew starts on the electrical work tomorrow morning. They're going to begin with the common areas, upgrade all the lighting to something that doesn't make people look like they're already dead. What about the plumbing? I've got 2 guys coming in Thursday to assess the bathroom fixtures in the east wing. Nothing major, just replacing some of the grab bars that are starting to come loose and upgrading the shower heads to something with better water pressure. Janet was taking notes. For insurance purposes, I need to make sure all this work is properly documented and permitted. Already handled, Tank said. All permits pulled, all work will be done to code, full documentation for the state inspectors. I looked around Janet's conference room with its mahogany table and its view of downtown through floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 weeks ago, I'd been sitting in a plastic chair in a nursing home common room, listening to my son explain why my care was too expensive for his budget. Now I was the owner of that nursing home, with a construction crew ready to transform it into a place people would actually want to live. Janet, there's one more thing I need you to handle. What's that? I want you to prepare a letter to Marcus, informing him that the ownership of Sunset Manor has changed hands, and that all billing inquiries should now be directed to Sullivan Holdings LLC. Janet paused in her note-taking. When do you want me to send that letter? Not yet. I want him to discover the improvements first. I want him to start wondering where the money's coming from and who's paying for all the changes he's going to see over the next few weeks. Tank was nodding his approval. Let him sweat a little bit about the potential cost increases. Exactly. Marcus needs to understand that his decision to put me in the cheapest facility he could find has consequences he didn't anticipate. And when he comes to you asking about the changes, I thought about that for a moment, imagining Marcus walking through Sunset Manor's newly improved hallways, seeing fresh paint and better lighting and residents who actually looked like they were being cared for instead of just warehoused. When he comes to me asking about the changes, I'll tell him the truth, that sometimes when you try to save money by cutting corners on quality, you end up costing yourself a lot more than you bargained for. Janet finished her notes and closed the file. Frank, can I ask you something personal? Sure. What's your ultimate goal here? I mean, beyond improving the facility and teaching your son a lesson, what do you want the end result to be? That was a good question, and one I'd been thinking about since the day Marcus first mentioned moving me to Hillview Extended Care. My goal is for Marcus to understand what responsibility actually means, I said. Not just financial responsibility, but moral responsibility. The responsibility that comes from being someone's son, and the responsibility that comes from being in a position to help people who can't help themselves. I stood up from the conference table and shook Janet's hand. I want him to learn that when you take care of people properly, when you invest in their well-being instead of just trying to manage them as cheaply as possible, everyone benefits, including you. Tank and I walked out of Janet's office together, two old construction guys who'd just bought a nursing home. In the elevator, Tank turned to me with that same grin he'd had during the Morrison project. You know, boss, 30 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be helping you buy the place where my wife lives, I'd have thought they were crazy. Life's funny that way, I said. It is, but this is good work we're doing. The kind of work that matters. The elevator opened onto the parking garage, and Tank headed toward his truck while I called for a cab back to Sunset Manor. My nursing home now, the place where Marcus thought he'd parked his inconvenient father until his remaining time ran out. Marcus had no idea what kind of education he was about to receive, but he was going to start learning very soon. Marcus arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after I'd signed the purchase agreement, and I could tell from the look on his face that he'd noticed the changes. The fresh coat of paint in the hallways, the new LED lighting that made everyone look like they were actually alive instead of preparing for the morgue, the landscaping outside that Tank's nephew had installed over the weekend. But mostly I could tell he'd noticed because he looked like a man who'd just walked into the wrong building and was trying to figure out how he'd gotten there. I was in the common room when he walked in, sitting in one of the new chairs Eleanor had ordered. Actual comfortable chairs with proper cushioning instead of those plastic torture devices they'd had before. The residents were more active than I'd seen them since I'd arrived, some of them actually talking to each other instead of just staring at the television. Dad, Marcus said, walking over to where I was sitting, what the hell is going on here? Hello to you too, son. I'm doing fine, thanks for asking. Marcus wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. No, seriously, what happened to this place? It looks completely different from when I was here last month. I folded the newspaper I'd been reading and looked up at him. You think it looks different? Think? Dad, they've got new carpet in the hallways, new lighting everywhere, and there are actual flowers planted outside. Last time I was here, this place looked like a government building from the 70s. I said, as if I was just noticing the improvements for the first time. You know, now that you mention it, the staff has been doing a lot of work around here lately. Marcus looked around the common room, taking in the fresh paint on the walls, the new furniture, the fact that the television was playing at a reasonable volume instead of loud enough to wake the dead. Who's paying for all this? He asked. That was the question I'd been waiting for. The question that had probably been keeping Marcus awake at night ever since he'd walked through the front door and realized that the cheap nursing home he'd dumped me in was starting to look like someplace people might actually want to live. I don't really know, I told him, but Eleanor mentioned something about new ownership. Apparently, the facility was sold a few weeks ago to some investment company. Marcus's face went white. Sold? To who? I think she said it was called Sullivan Holdings or something like that. Why? I watched Marcus process that information, watched him do the math in his head about what new ownership might mean for the monthly fees he was paying. His jaw tightened, and I could see a muscle twitching near his left eye. Dad, when did this sale happen? Did anyone tell you about it? Did you get any paperwork or notifications? I might have gotten something in the mail, I said, maintaining the confused old man act that Marcus seemed to expect from me. You know how it is, all these legal documents look the same to me. I think Eleanor has been handling most of that stuff. Where is Eleanor? I need to talk to her right now. She's probably in her office. You remember where that is, don't you? Down the hall past the new water fountain they installed last week. Marcus practically ran out of the common room, and I settled back into my comfortable new chair to wait. Through the window, I could see Tank and one of his guys working on the irrigation system for the new flower beds. Tank caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. Everything was going according to plan. About 10 minutes later, Marcus came back into the common room, looking like he'd just been told his house was on fire. Dad, we need to talk, privately. Of course. Do you want to go to my room? We walked down the hallway to room 237, past the new artwork Eleanor had selected to replace those generic landscapes that had made the place feel like a hotel lobby from 1985. Marcus was quiet during the walk, but I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. When we got to my room, Marcus closed the door behind us and turned to face me. Dad, I just talked to Eleanor, and she told me that the new ownership is planning major renovations over the next 6 months. New bathrooms, upgraded medical equipment, expanded dining facilities, the works. I sat down on the edge of my bed. That sounds nice. This place could use some improvements. Nice. Dad, do you understand what this means? These kinds of improvements are going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, and guess who's going to end up paying for them? The new owners? No, Dad. The residents. Eleanor told me that the monthly fees are going to be adjusted to reflect the upgraded amenities and services. We're looking at a potential increase from $3,200 a month to $4,500, maybe even $5,000. Marcus started pacing back and forth in the small space between my bed and the window. That's an extra $1,800 to $2,800 a month, Dad. $21,000 to $33,000 more per year. I can't afford that kind of increase. I watched my son pace, watched him calculate the financial impact of improvements that were designed to make my life better, and I felt something that might have been pity. Here was a man who'd inherited over $200,000 worth of assistance from his father over the years, and he was panicking about an increase in care costs that might add up to what I'd spent on his wedding and college loans combined. What are you saying, Marcus? He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. I'm saying we need to move you out of here before these renovations are complete. We need to get you transferred to Hillview Extended Care as soon as possible, before the new ownership starts charging premium rates for this place. There it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. Marcus had just told me, in his own words, that he wanted to move me to a substandard facility to avoid paying for the improvements that would make my life better. You want to move me to Hillview? Dad, we don't have a choice. If we stay here, the costs are going to be completely unsustainable. Hillview is $1,800 a month, and it's basically the same level of care. Basically the same level of care. I thought about the state inspection reports I'd read for Hillview, the citations for inadequate staffing and improper medication management. When would this move happen? As soon as possible. I already called them this morning and they have an opening. I can have the paperwork ready by Friday. Marcus pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. I'm going to call the intake coordinator at Hillview right now and see if we can get you moved by the end of the week, before this place starts charging those premium rates. That's when I knew it was time to stop playing the confused old man and start being the owner of Sunset Manor. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying an authority he hadn't heard from me in months. Put the phone down. We need to have a different conversation. Marcus showed up 3 days later with transfer papers and a private aide, thinking speed would prevent any resistance from me or the staff. It was Friday morning, just after breakfast, and he walked into my room like a man on a mission. Dad, I've got good news, he said, though his expression suggested he knew I might not see it that way. I was able to expedite your transfer to Hillview Extended Care. They had a last-minute opening, and I grabbed it before someone else could. The aide he'd brought with him was a thin woman in her 50s who looked like she'd done this kind of thing before. Emergency transfers of elderly residents whose families had decided they couldn't afford their current arrangements. She was already looking around my room, probably calculating how long it would take to pack up my few belongings. Transfer? I asked, maintaining the confused voice I'd been using with Marcus for weeks. When did we decide I was transferring somewhere? We talked about this on Tuesday, Dad. Remember, the costs here are about to go through the roof with all these renovations. Hillview is a much more sensible option financially. Marcus pulled out a folder of paperwork and set it on my nightstand. I've already handled all the insurance transfers and medical records. The aide here, Mrs. Patterson, is going to help you get packed up and we can have you moved by this afternoon. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with a professional smile. Sullivan, I know this kind of transition can be overwhelming, but I'm here to make it as smooth as possible. Why don't we start by gathering your clothing and personal items? I looked at Marcus standing there with his clipboard and his plans, so confident that he'd solved his problem before it could get any more expensive. So certain that his 72-year-old father would just go along with whatever arrangement he'd made. What if I don't want to transfer, Marcus? He looked genuinely surprised by the question. Dad, we've been over this. The monthly costs here are going to become completely unsustainable. Hillview offers the same basic care for less than half the price. The same basic care? Well, yes. I mean, they're both licensed nursing facilities. They both provide meals, medical supervision, assistance with daily activities. The fundamentals are the same. I thought about the state inspection reports I'd read for Hillview, the complaints about inadequate staffing and medication errors. I thought about the 3 citations they'd received in the past year for failing to meet basic care standards. Marcus, have you actually visited Hillview? Have you seen the facility where you want to move me? I've seen their website and I've talked to their admissions coordinator. Dad, look, I know change is difficult, but sometimes we have to make practical decisions based on financial reality. That's when Eleanor Martinez appeared in my doorway. Mr. Sullivan, she said, addressing Marcus. I'm sorry to interrupt, but before your father is transferred, there's someone who needs to meet with you. The facility's new owner would like to have a conversation about the transition process. Marcus looked confused. The new owner? Why would the new owner want to meet with me? Standard procedure when longtime residents are being transferred, Eleanor said smoothly. Just to make sure we're handling everything properly for documentation purposes. Mrs. Patterson had started opening my dresser drawers, but Eleanor held up a hand to stop her. I'm going to have to ask you to pause the packing for just a few minutes while we handle this administrative requirement. Marcus checked his watch impatiently. How long is this going to take? I've got the transport arranged for this afternoon, and Hillview is expecting us by 3 o'clock. It shouldn't take long at all, Eleanor said. The owner is actually here today, which is unusual. Most of these meetings have to be scheduled weeks in advance. Fine, Marcus said, but let's make this quick. Eleanor led Marcus and Miss Patterson down the hallway toward the administrative offices, leaving me alone in room 237 for what Marcus thought would be the last time. Through my window, I could see Tank in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, watching the building. He caught my eye and tapped his watch. Everything was right on schedule. I straightened my tie and walked to the mirror above my dresser. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had stood in this same room and explained to me why my care was too expensive for his budget. He'd calculated the cost of my remaining time like I was a subscription service he wanted to cancel. Now he was about to discover what happens when you try to dispose of someone who spent 30 years learning how to solve problems that other people think are impossible. I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room, multiple sets of footsteps moving towards Sarah Chen's office. Marcus was about to meet the new owner of Sunset Manor, and I had a feeling that conversation was going to be very different from what he was expecting. Mrs. Patterson had left her packing supplies on my bed, boxes and tape and labels for a transfer that wasn't going to happen. Marcus had brought his folder of paperwork for a move that he'd planned without consulting the one person who had the authority to approve or deny it. Me, I took one last look around room 237, the room where Marcus thought he'd parked his inconvenient father until the problem resolved itself. Then I walked down the hallway towards Sarah's office, where my son was about to get the education he'd been asking for his entire adult life, the education about what responsibility actually costs, and what happens when you try to cut corners on taking care of the people who've taken care of you. When Marcus walked into Sarah Chen's office, I was already sitting behind her desk, wearing the navy blue suit that Tank had brought from my storage unit the day before. The suit I'd worn to close million-dollar construction deals, the one that reminded everyone in the room that I knew exactly what I was doing and had the resources to back it up. Marcus stopped in the doorway like he'd walked into the wrong room. Dad, what are you doing here? Eleanor said we were meeting with the new owner. Hello, Marcus, I said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. Please sit down. He didn't move, just stood there staring at me, his brain trying to process why his father was sitting behind the administrator's desk instead of in room 237, waiting to be transferred to a cheaper facility. Mrs. Patterson looked confused too, glancing back and forth between Marcus and me like she was watching a tennis match she didn't understand. I don't get it, Marcus said. Where's the owner? Eleanor said. Eleanor said the new owner wanted to meet with you, I interrupted. And here I am. The silence in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus just stared at me, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to make sense of what I'd just told him. That's not possible, he said finally. Sit down, Marcus. Dad, you're a resident here. You can't be the owner. You don't have that kind of money. I opened the manila folder that Janet Morrison had prepared for me, and pulled out the purchase agreement with my signature at the bottom. Sullivan Holdings LLC, I said, sliding the document across the desk toward him. Sole managing member Frank Sullivan. Purchase price $2.4 million, closed 3 weeks ago. Marcus picked up the document with shaking hands. His face went from confused to pale to something that might have been terror as he read through the paperwork. This can't be real, he whispered. It's very real. Mrs. Patterson, would you mind giving my son and me a few minutes to talk privately? The aide looked relieved to be dismissed. She practically ran out of the office, probably figuring she'd stumbled into some kind of family drama that was way above her pay grade. After she left, Marcus sank into the chair across from the desk. I don't understand. Where did you get $2.4 million? Marcus, do you remember what I did for a living for 30 years? You were a construction foreman. I owned a construction company, Sullivan Construction. I built half the commercial district downtown, including the building where your consulting firm has its offices. I could see Marcus trying to reconcile this information with the image he'd had of his father as someone who needed financial assistance and couldn't afford quality care. But you always said money was tight. You drove that old pickup truck for 15 years. You lived in the same house for 25 years. I lived below my means, Marcus. I saved my money instead of spending it on things I didn't need. I invested wisely, and yes, I spent a lot of it making sure my son never had to worry about money the way I did when I was starting out. Marcus was staring at the purchase agreement like it was written in a foreign language. $250,000, I continued. That's what I spent on your education, your wedding, your house, your business. $250,000 to give you the kind of financial security that most people never get. Dad, and when I had a stroke and needed care, when I needed you to step up and take responsibility for your father the way I'd taken responsibility for you, what did you do? Marcus didn't answer. You shopped around for the cheapest nursing home you could find. You calculated how much my remaining time was going to cost you. You stood in my room and explained to me why paying for decent care was too much of a financial burden for your family. I stood up from behind the desk and walked around to where Marcus was sitting. So I decided to test your character, son. I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become when you thought your father was powerless and dependent on your generosity. Marcus looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It might have been the first time in his adult life that he was seeing me as something other than a financial resource or a burden to be managed. This whole thing, the nursing home, the renovations, all of it. You planned this? I bought this place 3 weeks ago. Tank and his crew have been working on improvements ever since. The new lighting, the fresh paint, the landscaping outside, that's all been my money, my planning, my decision about what kind of facility I wanted to live in. But why didn't you just tell me? Why go through all this? Because I needed to know who you really were, Marcus. Not the person you pretend to be when you need something from me, but the person you are when you think you have all the power and I have none. I walked back around the desk and sat down. You failed the test, son. When you thought I was helpless, when you thought I couldn't do anything about the situation you'd put me in, you chose the cheapest option available. You prioritized your financial comfort over my well-being. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. And now, he asked finally, now you understand that your father isn't the helpless old man you thought he was. I own this building, Marcus. I employ the staff who take care of me. I decide what improvements get made and how much they cost. What about the transfer to Hillview? There is no transfer to Hillview. There never was going to be a transfer to Hillview. Marcus looked around Sarah's office, taking in the state licensing certificates on the walls, the inspection reports, the administrative files that represented the lives of 43 residents whose care was now my responsibility. I don't know what to say. You could start with an apology, not just for putting me in the cheapest facility you could find, but for the way you've been thinking about me for the past few months, like I was an expense to be minimized instead of your father who deserved to be treated with dignity. Marcus was quiet again. After that, I continued, you could ask yourself what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. Because things are going to be different from now on, son. I'm not the dependent father you thought you were managing. I'm a business owner who happens to be your dad, and I'm going to be around for a lot longer than you estimated. I picked up the purchase agreement and put it back in the manila folder. The question is, Marcus, what kind of man do you want to be when your father doesn't need your help but might still want your company? For the first time since he'd walked into that office, Marcus looked directly at me. I want to be better than the man who was here 10 minutes ago. That was the first thing he'd said all day that gave me hope. 6 months later, Marcus visits every Sunday, not because he has to, but because he wants to. That's a distinction that matters more than I thought it would when I first bought this place. He arrives around 2 o'clock, after lunch but before the afternoon activities Eleanor has organized. We usually sit in the garden that Tank's nephew installed, the one with the fountain that drowns out the traffic noise from the highway. It's become our routine, these Sunday conversations that feel nothing like the hurried phone-checking visits from before. Last Sunday, Marcus brought his daughter Katie, my granddaughter, who's now 15, and apparently thinks her grandfather is pretty cool for an old guy who owns a business. She spent an hour talking to Rosa Rodriguez, Tank's wife, helping her work on a jigsaw puzzle. Rosa doesn't remember much from day to day anymore, but she remembers kindness, and Katie has plenty of that. You know, Dad, Marcus said, watching his daughter help Rosa find the right pieces. I never asked you why you didn't just tell me about the money from the beginning. Why you let me think you needed my help when you could have bought and sold my consulting business 10 times over. That's the kind of question Marcus asks now, the kind that shows he's been thinking about things beyond monthly expenses and quarterly projections. I wanted you to take care of me because I was your father, I told him. Not because I could afford to pay you back for it. There's a difference between obligation and affection, son. I needed to know which one I was getting from you. Marcus nodded slowly. He's gotten better at listening over the past 6 months, better at understanding that some conversations require more than quick solutions and cost-benefit analysis. I failed that test pretty badly, didn't I? You failed it completely, I said. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Sunset Manor is a different place now. The state inspectors who came through last month gave us the highest rating they'd ever assigned to a facility in this county. Eleanor has a waiting list of families who want to move their parents here, which is something nobody could have imagined when I first arrived in room 237 8 months ago. Tank finished the major renovation work 2 months ago, but he still comes by twice a week to check on things. His official title is Director of Facilities Management, which basically means he makes sure everything works the way it's supposed to work. Rosa is one of our residents now, and Tank lives in the apartment we built for staff members who want to be close to their family members. The monthly fees did go up, just like Eleanor told Marcus they would. We're charging $4,200 now, which reflects the actual cost of providing quality care to people who deserve it. Most of the families didn't complain about the increase because they could see what their money was paying for. Better food, more staff, upgraded medical equipment, and a place that feels like home instead of a warehouse for inconvenient relatives. Marcus pays the $4,200 without complaint now. More than that, he understands why it costs what it costs, and he's never again suggested that we look for cheaper alternatives. The inheritance was never really at stake, was it? He asked me last month during one of our Sunday conversations. No, I told him. The money was always going to be yours eventually, but I needed to know what kind of man would be receiving it. I needed to know if you'd learned the lessons I'd tried to teach you about responsibility and taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. And have I learned those lessons? I looked around the garden where we were sitting, at the other residents and their families enjoying their Sunday visits, at the staff members who now work for a facility that gives them the resources they need to actually help people instead of just managing their decline. You're learning them, I said. That's good enough for now. The truth is, Marcus isn't the same man who stood at the foot of my bed 8 months ago and calculated the cost of my remaining time. He's become someone who asks better questions and makes decisions based on more than just immediate financial impact. He's become the kind of son I always hoped he could be, even when I wasn't sure he would be. I built houses for 30 years, but the most important construction project I ever undertook was rebuilding my relationship with my son. It took strategic planning, careful execution, and a willingness to invest in something that might not pay dividends for a long time. But it was worth every penny of the $2.4 million I spent on this place, and every moment of the education Marcus received about what it means to take responsibility for the people who've taken responsibility for you. These Sunday visits we have now? This is what I was really building toward all along. Not revenge, not punishment, but the chance for both of us to be better than we were before. Sometimes the best construction jobs are the ones where you have to tear down what's there before you can build something that will last.